Dulles was always quoting his grandfather, and certainly the grandfather's influence, even in his career. The father, Dulles' father wanted him to be a minister. He wanted to be like his grandfather, a diplomat, a lawyer.
Mike, should we get started?
Whenever you're ready.
Okay. We'll have people trickling in all afternoon. Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the Center's History and Public Policy program, which of course includes the Center's long-standing Cold War International History project, known far better than the new header to many of you. Very pleased to welcome you to this very special event here today, jointly organized with the Harry S. Truman Museum and Library, which this year is celebrating its 50th anniversary. Over the years, the Truman Library and Museum in Independence, Missouri, have done important work to further research and reflections on the Truman presidency. I'm, in fact, proud to be a former grantee of one of the Institute's dissertation year grant programs, which allowed me to conduct research at the library, the National Archives, and other repositories. So it's a special pleasure to welcome Mike Devine, the director of the Library and Institute, and his colleagues here, with whom, of course, we have cooperated on a number of occasions over the years. You can hardly discuss the Truman administration here in Washington without thinking about comparisons to and lessons for today. Some of you may remember the story that broke last December when Senator Richard Durbin reported on a meeting with President Bush in which the president seemed to be comparing his situation to that of Truman in the late 1940s. Truman's legacy also figured in the 2004 presidential campaign when the president was referenced repeatedly, often in connection with his role in helping to reconstruct Germany and Japan after World War II. Some of you, of course, also may remember similar occurrences in the early 1990s following the publication of David McCulloch's Truman biography, which saw the beginning of a renewed public and political interest in Truman and his legacy. As Congressman Ike Skelton, the current chairman of the Armed Services Committee, whose father was a longtime friend of the late president and who met Truman as a young man, said then, everyone loves a winner, and history reflects Harry S. Truman was a winner. Now, our primary task today is to go back to the dawn of the Cold War. We want to take some time this afternoon to discuss new scholarship on the Truman administration and the Cold War. We will do this with the help of some of the leading scholars that will participate in today's event. And as you will see, the Truman presidency remains a vibrant and controversial field of research. Later then this afternoon, we will also have the privilege to hear from Mr. Ken Heckler, who has not only published on the Truman presidency, but also was an eyewitness to the Truman White House, the beginning of an illustrious career in government. We also look forward to hearing from Congressman Skelton himself during a reception later this evening. We have a very full program, so let me stop here and turn the floor over to Mike Devine for some welcome remarks, but not without thanking my colleagues here at the center, in particular Mircea Munteanu and Ryan Gage in the back there, as well as our talented and dedicated interns, Sarah Schwerin, Tim McDonald, and Ashley Takuba, all of whom have worked hard to make this event here today happen. Mike, you have the floor.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Christian. I'm indebted to you and your fine staff as well for the cooperation and the effort you've put forth to put this program together. We're delighted, and I speak on behalf of the Truman Presidential Library and its private sector partner, the Truman Library Institute. I'm delighted to be partnering with the Woodrow Wilson Center on this important event here in Washington, and we're certainly looking forward to Ken's remarks, Ken Heckler's remarks later, and a visit by one of our favorite members of the United States Congress, Representative Skelton, later today. Every 2 years, the Truman Presidential Library and Institute offer a Truman Book Award for outstanding scholarship on the Truman era. This most recent competition included 26 books written in the previous 2 years. Just outstanding work, and amazing the vitality of the Truman scholarship that still comes forth. I would guess that in our current book competition we'll have an equal number of outstanding entries, including entries from authored by two of the presenters here in this first panel. I should point out that while my signature appears on the check that goes out to the Truman Book Award winner, but I am not involved in the selection process at all. Let me make that clear. I can't be lobbied today or influenced. But I did want to point out the tremendous interest that President Truman, his era, his legacy, still generates among scholars, and as I think we'll see today, the depth of analysis that still offers us fresh ideas and insights into this most remarkable individual and this amazing period in the years following the Second World War. Our chair today is a dean of the Truman scholarly community. Dr. Richard Kirkendall for many years taught at the University of Missouri, where he directed the dissertations of numerous graduate students who went on to distinguished careers. Dick Kirkendall then went on to the University of Indiana, then to the University of Washington, where he's now Professor Emeritus. Many of the members of the history profession know Dick not only for his scholarship on Truman and the Truman era, but as the longtime secretary of the Mississippi Valley Historical Association, the parent of the Organization of American Historians. So please join me in welcoming the chair of our first session, Dr. Richard Kirkendall.
Thank you very much, Mike. I enjoy working with Mike, and I have been able to do that the last several years. And I'm very pleased to be here and to participate in a discussion of new scholarship on the Truman Presidency. This is a story that I've been following now for half a century, the development of Truman historiography. It began for me when the Truman Library opened in 1959, and I was a young assistant professor at the University of Missouri. And my first doctoral candidate was on the steps of the Truman Library waiting for it to open so he get started in a serious way on his dissertation. That was May 8, 1959. This is a scholar named Gene Schmidtlein, and he indeed did write a dissertation on Truman as senator. In those early years, the dominant interpretation among historians who were paying any attention to Truman could best be labeled, I think, a liberal interpretation. According to the elder Schlesinger, Truman was regarded by historians in the early 1960s as at least a near great president, and the emphasis was placed upon his foreign policy in reaching that conclusion, but there were also features of his domestic agenda that contributed to it. I learned from working with a very talented group of graduate students at the University of Missouri, and they published some of the first monographs on the Truman presidency in the 60s and the 70s. People such as Alonzo Hamby, and Susan Hartman. And Susan is here today, I'm pleased to say, benefiting from a fellowship from the Wilson Center. Beginning in the mid-'60s, that interpretation was challenged by a brand of revisionism. I was introduced to that revisionism by two historians, Athan Theoharis and Barton Bernstein. Athan told me in 1965 that a great book was about to be published that made it very clear that Truman did not drop the bomb in order to influence the Japanese. He dropped the bomb in order to influence the leaders of the Soviet Union. I became acquainted with Bart the next year as he participated in a conference at the Truman Library that I organized. So those were the two that really helped me to understand from an early point what that revisionism amounted to. Then in the early 70s, what came quickly to be called post-revisionism emerged. For me, John Gaddis was the person who introduced me to it. We participated in a program at the American Historical Association in 1972. And if my memory is right, someone who was in that session coined the term post-revisionism for this new interpretation that John represented. It was an interpretation that accepted some parts of the revisionist critique of Truman, but tended to emphasize Truman's accomplishments. So it wasn't just a continuation of what Theoharis and Bernstein and others had introduced. The early scholars suffered from restrictions on access to the sources, and their work was hampered by that. I complained about that at a 1965 meeting of the Organization of American Historians. It was a meeting, or a session at least, that took place in the Truman Library, and I argued that the Truman Library would never become as great as the Franklin Roosevelt Library was already if there was not a more liberal policy governing access to sources. All I did was anger a few folks. I didn't accomplish anything that benefited the scholars by speaking out in this way. Then in the late 70s and early 80s, the situation improved considerably. One improvement was the opening of many personal papers of the president, including by the mid-'80s, the letters that he had written to his wife. The person who introduced me to that change when it emerged was my colleague then at Indiana University, Robert Farrell. He was the first one to see these newly released papers, and it really took us by surprise that there was such a rich collection of personal correspondence that Truman had produced. The second major change that facilitated scholarship on Truman's presidency was declassification, and that was moving forward rapidly in the 1980s. I first benefited from that about 1985 when I was working on a paper on Truman and the establishment of the Air Force, and it was exciting to see the declassified stamps on papers. Just the kind of thing that I wished I could have seen back in the 1960s when I filed that complaint. But it was exciting that they were now available. Well, these books that we'll be talking about this morning, that the authors will be talking about this morning, show us what can be done with the rich sources that are now available for the study of the Truman presidency. Both Wilson Miscamble and Robert Beisner have made heavy use of the kinds of materials that I just mentioned briefly. They are truly massive programs of research, that are the basis for these papers. They're what can be done by talented historians now who are working in the Truman period. And the two of them make major contributions, as you will see if you haven't already seen by reading the book. Bill challenges the idea that Truman began the Cold War by breaking quickly with Franklin Roosevelt's Soviet policy. And Bob explores the somewhat complex and very productive relationship between Truman and Acheson on the development of American Cold War policy. They represent, as I read them, an anti-revisionist interpretation of the Truman presidency that has become very prominent in the historical profession since the end of the Cold War. I don't think that I need to give you the details of their career. You have a handout that you were able to pick up and when you came in there. I think I should just get out of the way and let Bill and Bob talk about these very important books that they have so recently published. So, Bill, if you'll...
Thanks very much. I want to thank you all for coming here this afternoon. It's good to see folks still interested in the Truman presidency. Time is limited, but I must take a moment to thank Christian and Ryan and the other folks here at the Wilson Center for their work in organizing and promoting scholarship on the Cold War. And also I want to thank Dr. Michael Devine and all of his wonderful staff at the Truman Library, not only for sponsoring today's event, but even more so for making the Truman Library such a wonderful place for scholars to do research. I must add it's a special pleasure to sit on this panel with Bob Beisner. His Acheson study is terrific and should be on your bookshelf. Of course, I wouldn't object if you also put my own book on your bookshelf. I want to share some of the main conclusions of my book. My work addresses some topics that have been rather controversial in Cold War historiography over the last 4 decades. Dick Kirkendall sort of alluded to these debates between various schools. I address these topics in what I hope is a thoughtful, if forceful manner, and I aim to correct certain misinterpretations which have skewed a proper understanding of Truman's foreign policy in the onset of the Cold War. My work relies on the scholarship of many other historians, but I won't try to list all of them in my remarks here today. But I hold that my book sheds light on some of these topics. Truman's pre-presidential foreign policy background, FDR's vision for the post-war world and his efforts to implement that vision, the issue that Dick referred to of continuity or reversal between Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, the Potsdam Conference and how to think about it, the whole issue of the atomic bomb and its use, the question of atomic diplomacy, Truman and the American movement to containment and the Cold War, which necessitates my exploring another topic recently investigated here at the Wilson Center, the whole nature of the Soviet threat, which the West confronted. And in the process, I have some arguments to offer about the role of the British in the onset of the Cold War. Churchill and Eden replaced by Attlee and Bevan. Bevan, in particular, an important player in my view. And of course, I offer something of a portrayal of Truman and his dealings with his various advisors. So I touch on some of these in these remarks that I want to offer, but some more than others. I'd be glad in the various discussion times that we have to try and go further into those matters if they're of interest to you. On April the 8th, 1949, Ernest Bevan, good social democrat, democratic socialist that he was, sent a note of thanks to Harry Truman on the stationery of the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. 4 days earlier, Bevan, the British Foreign Secretary, had signed the North Atlantic Treaty in the American capital, and that significant occasion obviously prompted him to reflect on the journey travelled over the previous couple of years. Bevan expressed gratitude to Truman for his, quote, great efforts on behalf of Europe. He noted that aid to Greece and Turkey had helped secure the independence of the Middle East, and that a series of measures had helped restore confidence in and secured the independence of the European nations. Truman replied to Bevan soon after and expressed pleasure at the British Foreign Secretary's survey of the world situation. The President went further and engaged in some retrospective reflection of his own. And please note, I quote here, naturally, he wrote Bevan, we have all been disappointed by the attitude of the Russians. I tried for more than 2 years to reach an understanding with them, but I have at last come to the conclusion that that is an impossibility unless the Russians know they can't run over the rest of the world. End of quote. Bevan undoubtedly would have agreed with Truman's analysis because he expended a lot of energy over the period when he took over as Foreign Secretary through to, which was Potsdam, July 1945, through to 1947, not only seeking to alert the American administration of the dangers of Soviet expansion, but also maneuvering to draw the United States into a more vigorous response to it. Both men understood in retrospect that it took time for the American government to move beyond the assumptions and policies that Truman inherited from Franklin Roosevelt and to address the post-war realities of a gravely weakened Europe and a threatening Soviet Union. What Bevan and Truman clearly understood in 1949 has not always been well comprehended by American historians who subsequently, particularly after 1965 and the revisionist sweep, who subsequently portrayed Truman as overseeing a sharp reversal in FDR's cooperative approach to the Soviets. Such an interpretation, I want to argue, is not supported by substantial evidence. Rather, to be blunt, and why mess around on these things? It was built on a quicksand of faulty assumptions and misused tissues of evidence. The time has come for notions of sharp departures or reversals in foreign policy from Roosevelt to Truman to be dispatched to the burial grounds for flawed interpretations, wherever that may be. Use your imaginations. Claims that Roosevelt's death and Truman's accession to power either caused or contributed significantly to the outbreak of the Cold War need to be pensioned off once and for all. The reality is that Truman initially attempted to follow his predecessor's footsteps. Now, to assure a proper understanding of American foreign policy from 1944 to 1947, the time period that my book tries to deal with in some detail, one must comprehend Roosevelt's rather romantic plans and vision for the post-war world. How such plans initially guided Truman and how it took Truman's administration substantial time to forge a realistic foreign policy, including a new approach to the Soviet Union. Here, let me prepare you. I'm about to criticize FDR. This gets you into a lot of trouble, let me assure you, but it must be done. Franklin Roosevelt nebulously planned for a post-war world in which continued collaboration between the Big Four of the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and China would assure an era of some peace and prosperity powered by free trade among nations. In his visionary scenario, Europe, and especially Germany, would be greatly reduced in significance in world affairs. FDR expected the United States to be engaged in the world, but he couldn't foresee any extensive and permanent American military or political commitments far beyond the Western Hemisphere, and certainly not in Europe. He thought that Britain and the Soviet Union could oversee European developments. The American leader worked during the war to build a cooperative relationship with the Soviet opposite. Rather naively, I would hold, he relied on his hunches and intuitions and held the hope that he could civilize or domesticate the Soviet beast and establish a personal connection with Stalin. Operating on this sad delusion, Roosevelt fashioned a strategy towards the Soviets based on personal connections and significant concessions aimed at reassuring them. Rather than pursuing a hard-headed political military strategy, which many of his knowledgeable advisors recommended, especially from mid-44, aftermath of the Warsaw Uprising onwards, Roosevelt pursued collaboration with Stalin to the end. Filled with idealistic hopes for the success of a new international body, Roosevelt made concessions to Stalin at Yalta to secure Soviet participation in it. He believed that the UN would serve as a vehicle to prevent American disengagement from world affairs after the war. Of course, he feared a return to pre-war isolationism. Understandably, he vested the UN with notable importance. But doing so led him to perpetuate what I would call an adolescent idealism among the American people on post-war possibilities. They were thinking of a different kind of world than, sadly, the realities were going to allow. They turned a blind eye, for the most part, to the Soviet establishment of their control over much of Eastern Europe. Better not to confront the real issues that divided the wartime allies, better to build the UN on foundations of shifting sand rather than honestly face the fundamentally different worldviews and interests of the major powers which inevitably dominated post-war international politics. Franklin Roosevelt, that great conjurer and juggler, left to his successor rather inflated expectations and unrealistic hopes for post-war peace, which influenced and restricted the Truman administration's policymaking for almost 2 years. My book reveals the Truman administration moved rather slowly and in a halting manner away from Roosevelt's assumptions on cooperation with the Soviet Union and on the importance of the UN. For a long time, those assumptions guided Truman. When Truman came to office, he had neither the interest nor the desire to alter Roosevelt's policies. He sincerely wanted to implement the plans of his revered predecessor and to assure continuity in policy. His elemental assumptions placed him in the intellectual lineage of FDR. His recognition of the shameful and disastrous consequences of appeasement diplomacy and neutrality in the 30s led him to fear any return to American isolationism. Like FDR, he wanted the US to engage the world. Similarly, he held great faith in a new international organization. He hoped to work in a cooperative way to establish that organization and, of course, to end the war. The modest tensions evident in Truman's early dealings with Molotov in late April of 1945 should be understood as a part of his effort to secure the implementation of agreements which Roosevelt had negotiated, and thus to facilitate a successful meeting in San Francisco to form the United Nations. The dramatic character and political significance of the Truman-Molotov clash of April 23, 1945, which has received a lot of attention. You know, this is where Molotov supposedly heard Missouri mule drivers' language. I don't know, Mr. Heckler, if you ever heard that kind of language from the president, but I'm holding that Molotov didn't hear it from him either. The significance of the meeting has been exaggerated. The encounter was a mere tactic used in an ultimately unsuccessful effort to make progress on the crucial Polish issue. Those who focus on this episode miss the forest while fixating on a single tree. The broad sweep of American policy from April 45 to the Potsdam Conference consisted of a genuine effort to maintain cooperative relations with the Soviet Union. Guided by a renowned Sovietophile, Joseph Davies, Truman aimed to be even-handed in his dealings with Churchill's Britain and Stalin's Russia, and to avoid any hint of an Anglo-American collusion against the Soviet Union. I could give further details, but in the interest of time, let me press ahead. The appointment of James F. Burns as Secretary of State in July 1945 brought a different approach to the Truman administration. Burns, with Truman's backing, favoured the traditional diplomatic tactic of negotiation. He held none of FDR's illusions regarding his abilities to gain Stalin's trust, but still wanted to maintain decent relations with the Soviet Union by reaching practical settlements of the issues they faced. In light of this, Burns largely recognized the division of Europe foreshadowed at Yalta and secured through Soviet military domination of Eastern Europe. He pursued a quid pro quo approach and largely accepted a sphere of influence peace, hoping that this might secure a workable and stable post-war settlement. Burns hoped, certainly, that America's possession of the atomic bomb might add some weight to his side in the diplomatic bargaining of the post-Potsdam period, but, and this must be clearly understood, Truman authorized the actual use of the atomic bomb to defeat the Japanese and not as part of some anti-Soviet strategy. Fanciful notions of atomic diplomacy must be consigned to the historiographical dustbin. Most striking about America's sole possession of the atomic bomb is how little they sought to use it for diplomatic ends and purposes. The period from the fall of 1945 until the late fall of 1946 constitutes a period of transition. Perceptions of the Soviet Union changed and concerns about international behaviour and ambitions deepened, especially as regards Iran and Turkey. And yet, while various general alarms were raised by the likes of Winston Churchill and George Kennan, the American response remained rather episodic. No coherent response emerged, and much to the distress of Ernest Bevin and like-minded Europeans, the United States initially demonstrated no eagerness to step into the breach to balance and to counter Soviet influence on the continent. But in the end, Truman, initially guided by Burns and then by Secretaries of State Marshall and Acheson, broke free of FDR's hunches regarding Stalin. These Americans were less enamored of their own intuition and more willing to draw conclusions from Soviet actions and intentions. They increasingly accepted that US policy must resist Soviet demands and create barriers of sorts to their offensive operations. That story I try and tell in detail in my book. Let me move towards some concluding remarks. My examination of Truman's initial foreign policy sheds further light on the development of the Cold War conflict. It certainly raises major questions regarding the criticism which revisionist scholars regularly aimed at the Truman administration for not persisting with the cooperative approach of Roosevelt. As one of the best of this school portrayed it, almost from the end of World War II, American policymakers deliberately and willingly, quote, chose to contain and deter the Russians rather than to reassure and placate them. In light of the findings of my study, one might wish that had been so. But irony of ironies, however, it now seems clear that if the Truman administration warrants criticism for its initial foreign policy measures, then it deserves it not for reversing Roosevelt's policies, but for hewing too closely to them. Regrettably, the Truman administration probably expended too much energy in 1945-46 negotiating with the Soviets, and in a way attempting to reassure and placate them and to reach amicable settlements with them. It unfortunately took time for Truman and Burns to learn the essential lessons regarding Stalin and his ambitions. For too long, Truman entertained the counsel of former Ambassador Joseph Davies and tried to conform to the expectations established by Roosevelt's public vision. But to its eternal credit, the Truman administration drew the line. the fact that the United States mounted a defensive effort in late 46 and 47 to check Soviet advances and to steady the West Europeans to resist Soviet pressure and intimidation, strangely became in the hands of some Western academics an occasion for lumping on the United States a heavy share of the responsibility for the outbreak of the Cold War. The corollary to this argument is that measures such as the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and NATO escalated the Cold War dramatically and inappropriately. Lingering behind this argument lies the assumption that if only American policymakers had been more wise, more insightful in 1945-46, by reaching sympathetic agreements with the Soviet Union, then the Cold War as we know it might have been avoided. Well, such an assumption cannot withstand scrutiny. I think I have reached the end of my time. Have I, Dick? I could talk on at considerable length on this matter and look forward to further discussion. Thank you so much.
Afternoon. I want to first repeat Bill's thanks to both the Truman Library and the Woodrow Wilson Center for this affair and for promoting such scholarship. And I would like to thank Bill and at least two other people in the room for reading my unwieldy manuscript, or at least it was certainly very unwieldy for quite a while. Summarizing my book, which is biographical, but a policy study as well, would mean summarizing Truman's foreign policy. So that would take far too long. And instead what I would like to do, and not in such a nicely polished paper as Bill has just given us, but point by point, what I'd like to do is briefly describe some of the points and emphases in my book that may not be as obvious to people as knowledgeable as this group is about the Truman administration. People, excuse me, people who have been very close to Truman administration scholarship are not going to be surprised by much of what I say, but some of you may find it new. Let me start with Acheson himself. I found and described a man with an extraordinarily combative personality. He was an activist to his bones. He loved power. He was not afraid of fights. And for a man who held such high office, he got into a remarkable number of fights. I personally think that it would be very hard to appoint him nowadays, even though we might need such people. And this combative personality was very important for both Acheson's successes and his failures. His connection with Truman, as mentioned in the introduction, was vital. For background, let me just mention something that's well known, which is that Acheson, for a few months in 1933, at the very beginning of the New Deal, was Undersecretary of the Treasury. The Treasury Secretary grew ill, and Acheson found himself virtually acting as Secretary of the Treasury at a time when FDR wanted to issue, I won't go into the details, which I don't understand anyway, a monetary policy that was deliberately inflationary. And Acheson fought him on that. He said it's unfair to bondholders, it's dishonest, it's probably illegal. And Roosevelt said, do it. And Acheson said, that's easy for you to say. I have to sign the paper. And Truman and Roosevelt fired him. Now, very quickly after that, Acheson decided that he had been, that he was far more in the wrong than Roosevelt had been. that his job was not to contest directly with the president over such an issue. And when he came back into the government, appointed by Roosevelt in 1941, Roosevelt was a forgiving man. And once he began to work with Truman, Acheson was consciously determined, it was not simply instinctual or anything like that, to avoid having such fights again. And throughout the administration, throughout Acheson's period with Truman, you will find that Acheson goes to great lengths to make sure that they stay on the same track. Constant consultation. He gives Truman hundreds of pages of night reading, and Truman does the reading. They met depended on the week and what was going, but sometimes 10, 12 times a week. They were on the phone frequently. And during the period when Acheson was undersecretary, under Burns and then Marshall, both Burns and Marshall were out of the country a great deal, leaving Acheson as acting secretary. And during those 2 years, Acheson coached Truman, and he wooed Truman, and he gained Truman's trust. This was not important just for Acheson's personal agenda, but because he wanted to gain Truman's respect and trust, respect for and trust of the State Department, to reverse FDR's cavalier disregard and for and distrust of the State Department. Eventually, he gains Truman's trust sufficiently that Acheson gains for himself tremendous autonomy as Secretary of State. And in many areas, during different periods of time, you can go through mountains of Truman Library paper, memoranda, and so forth, and while they will make clear that Acheson is constantly keeping Truman informed, otherwise Truman's handprints are nowhere to be seen. So I'm personally quite, while sympathetic with Harry, very sympathetic also with the notion that in many cases Truman personally did not necessarily know what he was doing. And Acheson guided him very much like a powerful lawyer guides a client. Next point I'd like to make briefly has to do with administration. Not too many historians are interested in administration. Maybe it was 9 years as department chair that made me.
You're still standing.
Acheson's administration of the department was quite interesting. It began while he was undersecretary. If he did not exactly manage by walking around, he managed by talking and listening to virtually anyone. He was quite inclusive. His doors were open unless he had already determined that he was going to resist his counselor's recommendations. Then he would close the door, and they knew what that meant. Subordinates loved working for him because he backed them up so strenuously. When Congress tried to give hell to various people in his employ, if they were appointed by the president, essentially political appointees, Acheson's view was they can take care of themselves. If they were career people, he refused to give Congress their names. He would simply say, if you want to beat up on somebody, beat up on me. One reason he was so interested in all this talk and open discussion, on the one hand, he simply said that's the way he had to think, and he made decisions that way, not through paper, but through talking and listening. But he also wanted to get in on the policymaking process at an early, low level. He did not want to find himself faced with choices that had rigidified and turned into concrete when he would have preferred knowing what the alternatives were earlier. This is what he advised Marshall to do when he was undersecretary to Marshall, Don't wait, as you did in the Army, for things to come all the way to the top, because by then you won't have much of a choice. And then finally, just to continue on the Truman point for a minute, in the State Department, if item X was coming up and the department wanted to do X, Y, Z, and Acheson talked to Truman and Truman said no, Acheson would go back to the State Department and tell the people responsible, the president has decided against this. I don't want to hear any complaints about it. I don't want to see anything in the newspapers about it. We accept the president's will. It's his foreign policy. And that's one reason you don't find, there's a lot of bureaucratic infighting in the Truman administration, but it's not within the State Department. As an administrator, Acheson very much took the lead in policy toward all of Western Europe, toward the Soviet Union, toward China, toward Korea. Otherwise, he left his subordinates virtually everything, except in times of crisis. So that George McGee, for example, as an assistant secretary for Middle Eastern affairs, basically had the whole Middle East portfolio in 1949-50, but in 51 and 52, when very important issues were arising in Egypt and Iran, parallel, for similar reasons, nationalist pressure against the British, Acheson took control. Latin America, Acheson thought nothing in Latin America had any bearing on American security, and he left it all to Eddie Miller, who was his assistant secretary of state for the continent. And one of the most delightful things I ran into in my research was the time that Miller wrote Acheson at the time of the Bolivian Revolution in 1952 that the situation in Bolivia was, quote, critical but not serious. Acheson and Alger Hiss. I have an entire chapter on this subject, and I'll try to boil it down into a couple of sentences. Something like class prejudice and disgust with the people who were prominent U.S. anti-communists had a lot to do with Acheson's refusal to abandon Alger Hiss, who was not one of his favorite people. He was a, quote, friend, but he was not a close friend. He personally thought Hiss was a joyless man without a sense of humor. Acheson didn't like people like that. I think the crucial reason, in addition to what I've just mentioned, the crucial reason for his defense of Hiss was his friendship with his brother Donald Hiss, which I didn't know anything about when I started this, and I gradually had to learn, who Donald Hiss was. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but Donald Hiss was eventually a partner in Acheson's law firm during the war, and in the 1930s he was probably also a Soviet agent, but one who had never been asked to do any nasty deeds. The story is that he was once asked, and Alger intervened and said, "Leave my little brother alone." I personally think, and I so argue, that Acheson's declarations in behalf of Hiss were extremely reckless and politically damaging, and did great damage both to Acheson and the Truman administration. In 1949, moving to an entirely different subject, Acheson briefly flirted, more than briefly, for weeks, with George Kennan's attitudes toward Germany that aimed mainly at what Kennan was looking for was kind of a mutual withdrawal from Germany. Let Germany reunify, take care of itself, don't worry about the Soviets. it's remarkable that given Acheson's later attitudes on Germany, by mid-1949, Acheson is committed absolutely to bringing West Germany into the Western Alliance, and a year later to rearming it and bringing it into NATO. But when he first becomes Secretary of State, amazingly, he doesn't know much about Germany, and he's very persuaded by Kennan. He finally drops the idea for various reasons. This is also one chapter of many, I don't mean literally a chapter in my book, but one chapter among many in what could be a separate book, but I'm not going to write it, on Acheson's relationship with Kennan. It's just fascinating. They struggle with one another. They sympathize with one another. They're friends. At certain times, Kennan's support to Acheson is crucial, and Acheson is desperate to have it. And at other times, Acheson is utterly scornful of Kennan. And the scorn gets worse in later years after neither one is in government. I argue that Acheson's overall strategy toward the Soviet Union is inadequately described with the word containment. What Acheson said over and over, once he got a handle on what he wanted to do in the core issue of the Cold War, what Acheson said he wanted to do was eliminate areas of weakness and replace them with areas of strength. And that could mean all kinds of things. It could mean economic strength, military strength, political strength, or whatever. But he was aiming not at just containment. He didn't say it very often, but several times he specifically says that he doesn't like the idea of containment because it leaves you willy-nilly in the need to defend at any place, regardless of how important it might be. Instead, what he wanted to establish was much closer to what Melvin Loeffler calls a preponderance of power over the Soviet Union, so that the Cold War would finally end. And Acheson didn't seem to care how long it took. The Cold War would finally end when the Soviet Union simply acknowledged Western strength. And until then, there was no particular need to talk. He negotiated with Wyszynski and the Council of Foreign Ministers in Paris in the spring of 1949 and never talked to the Russians thereafter. Almost all of Acheson's negotiations as Secretary of State are with allies. And to reinforce something Bill said, Acheson said he had a lot of experience during World War II negotiated with the Soviets over Lend-Lease. And he said that, apart from what they might have stood for in terms of policy, the Russians were, quote, not housebroken, end quote. He didn't want to talk to them. He thought it was to no end, and he could see real problems resulting from being too eager to seek negotiations. It could break up the Western Alliance, it could mislead the public, and so forth. On China, Acheson took considerable political and personal risks. This is very strange. Acheson knew so much more about Europe than he did Asia, but he took his biggest political risks over Asia. And on China in particular, he tries very hard through 1949 into 1950, doesn't completely stop until the Korean War begins, trying to establish some kind of normal relationship with the People's Republic. Unaware that, as Chinese sources made available in the last decade, make very clear that the Chinese were not interested, that they were more interested in having a hostile relationship or a non-relationship with the United States. We can talk more about that if it comes up. On Korea, Acheson was as blind as his associates in backing MacArthur's march north above the 38th parallel. all of Washington was salivating at the chance to knock North Korea out entirely. I mean, you go back and read the press in after the Incheon invasion, and everybody is just, I mean, there's going to be a victory march down Times Square. And Acheson's record, as the evidence became more and more clear that the Chinese were going to intervene, is, I think, an extremely poor record. But I argue in the book that he's got to end up at least in third place in terms of shouldering blame for that. He's not the president, and he's not the Secretary of Defense. Truman and Marshall deserve the greatest blame. And at one point in my book, I used the phrase, the sainted Marshall. It's very hard to find people, historians, critical of Marshall, but he deserves a lot of criticism on that episode. Going back to Europe for a moment, Acheson, after 1950, mid-1950, after the Korean War began, pushed extremely hard for a German role in NATO. And through his entire period as Secretary of State on European issues, he tolerated, even while he disliked, the British tendency to be standoffish on European, quote, issues. And he characteristically pushed France to take the lead on European integration. But when the French dragged their heels in 1951 on their own creation, the European Defense Community, the EDC, there's a fascinating period of a few weeks in the summer of 51 when Acheson appears ready to simply tell the French to go to hell and to ram West Germany directly into NATO against French protests. And he was talked out of it by David Bruce, ambassador to France. Described by somebody, I've forgotten who, as the most pro-French ambassador we ever sent to Paris, but it played a very key role here. And once Acheson got over that hump, he then committed himself entirely to the EDC, come hell or high water. On Egypt and Iran, Acheson tried very hard to separate the United States from Britain and to draw those countries, revolutionary nationalists, to Washington's side, but in the end, the inescapable ties to Britain made his work impossible. Finally, because so many historians and other commentators have referred to Acheson as a realist, I take some pains in the book to indicate why that label is incorrect, or at least misleading. The purpose of U.S. policy, Acheson said over and over and over, was to make it possible for American ways and traditions to flourish. He wanted a world in which U.S. traditions, customs, ways of life could flourish. Those are not the concerns of a realist. He was quite willing to interfere in the internal affairs of other nations, which realists supposedly don't believe in. He never officially recognized, though he didn't challenge, the Soviet satellite empire in Eastern Europe. He believed the Cold War could end only when something profound changed in the nature of the Soviet regime. And though he did not try to transform foreign autocracies into democracies, he believed strongly that resistance to the Soviet Union was essential to protect America's democracy. Thank you.
Our plan now is to take a brief break. How long, Christian?